So there's this kind of joke, and I hate it, that I would hear a lot as a parole judge by people who know better, as well as in a family court attorney or criminal defense attorney. They would say that somebody's acting this way because they weren't hugged enough as a child. And they make fun of mental health treatment in that sense. And I think that concept of not being hugged enough as a child is a perfect concept because it's true. It's a complete concept because it's true. Studies have shown with post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as neglect of orphans, as well as there's an animal study that I'm going to discuss, that not having those needs met or having your neural transmitters impacted in a negative way actually rewires your brain and how you go on to interact with the world later on. For example, a commonly understood disorder is post-traumatic stress disorder. When you have a traumatic event or sustained traumatic events, could be combat, could be rape, could be witnessing a crime, car accident, that sort of thing. Those types of things, because of the rewiring of the brain, may lead to an exaggerated startle reflex. We also have issues with neurotransmitters impacting the way the brain's wired with trauma that's either acute trauma, meaning quick, done and over with, or sustained trauma, meaning over time, that rewires your brain and impacts your memory because the brain does what it needs to do to protect itself. And we're going to talk about doing what we need to do to protect ourselves versus moving beyond that. There was also a study looking at a longitudinal study, meaning a long-term study, looking at Soviet-era orphanages and how children were treated at the orphanage versus what their outcomes were against the rest of the population. And in these orphanages, it was common practice to make sure that the children were fed, make sure that they were cleaned or their hygienic needs were taken care of, that they had adequate heat and adequate clothing, and that was about it. There was not really any affection or anything like that. Over the course of time, what they discovered was that those children who grew up into adulthood had stunted social skills, they had stunted growth, they had stunted and an inability to effectively overcome medical complications compared to the rest of the population. There was also an anecdotal study, meaning it just happened one time, but they made they wrote a paper about it. There was a dog that came into a hospital that was kind of like the mascot of the hospital, and the dog had just a little wound on it. It was a little wound that could clear up no problem. But before the wound happened, the dog was the mascot, and everybody loved the dog, and everybody played with the dog. They did an experiment, and I'm not saying that this was, I think it was a terrible experiment, but what the experiment was they just left the dog with this tiny little wound go. They didn't pet it. They just made sure it had food, and that was it. They completely ignored the dog, no matter what the dog did, for a week as an experiment. The dog stopped eating, started deteriorating, and started snapping and snarling at people over the course of 1 week. Once they re-engaged with the dog and started petting it and playing with it, the wound, which had started to fester, began to heal, and the dog's outcomes were much better. So if you don't have all those hugs and your needs met, you start to go into that self-preservation mode.